And welcome everyone to the first of our guest lecture series in post-communist transition. Our first speaker needs little to no introduction for anyone familiar with his work in politics and development, political culture, and civil society in Eastern Europe. Dr. Jan Kubik is recognized in the academic world as a preeminent scholar on Eastern Europe in general and Poland in particular. He has been a mainstay in the Rutgers Political Science Department for more than 2 decades and briefly served as the director of the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies at University College London, where he still holds a faculty position. Dr. Kubik has published a multitude of books, academic articles, and media editorials, has been a contributor to this graduate seminar since its inauguration, and has been a good friend, mentor, and colleague of mine since I was a graduate student of his. So once again, Dr. Kubik, welcome back to the class.
I'm really glad to be here.
And I am exceptionally happy for you to be contributing on this, the 30th anniversary of the 1989 revolutions. And if I'm not mistaken, it begins, as it always begins in Poland, literally about 30 years ago this very month, correct?
Well, the anniversaries are underway in several places, but I suppose, although I do not have sort of detailed data on that, the biggest anniversary was in Gdańsk, where it all started 30 years ago in the shipyard. It was the anniversary of the first, at that time, semi-free elections in Poland. It was June the 4th. So there was a huge event in which I participated also as a speaker in Gdańsk several weeks ago. It lasted 2 days or 2 days and a half. It also showed a tremendous division in the country. But the main event, organized by the absolutely spectacular museum to the Solidarity movement called the European Solidarity Center in Gdańsk, over 3 or 4 days, I was told attracted 120,000 people, visitors. So it was a huge thing with all kinds of lectures, debates, meetings, book signings, and sort of there was this thing called Civic sphere, where there were tents and people, there were several events going simultaneously at the same time, whereas in the big lecture halls of the center, there were bigger kind of debates, international actually. So it was absolutely spectacular, but also there was a kind of a dark shadow over the whole thing, about which we may want to talk.
Yeah, one of the themes for this week in Central Europe has been the unfortunate decline in democratic ratings throughout Central Europe. I'm sure that you know that Hungary this past year was downgraded from free to partly free by Freedom House. And even though
I am an external expert from Freedom House, I'm very familiar with this decline. Yes.
Okay, so I mean, this is kind of the unfortunate dark shadow that you've mentioned. Before we get to Hungary, though, I thought that the students might like to get a general sense of what the solidarity movement was 30 years ago. What was it about solidarity that was such a tremendous socio-political, socio-cultural force that challenged the communist apparatus in Poland and ultimately forced them to negotiate?
Well, Poland was always the most rebellious country in the communist bloc. So there were rebellions of various magnitude, serious ones, starting in 1956, then students and the intelligentsia in 1968, then the workers in 1970, then the workers and intellectuals again in 76. Then a sort of a miracle happened. A archbishop from Krakow was elected to be the next pope, John Paul II, in 78. in 79, he came to visit Poland, which was the first visit by a pope in a communist country ever. And then in 1980, the workers went on strike in the port city of Gdańsk in the shipyard. Was all happening in August 1980. Very quickly, the others in Gdańsk and then throughout the whole country joined in. And by the end of the month, the communists capitulated for the first time again in history, allowing the formation of the independent labor union or trade union, whose name was then invented by someone. It was Solidarity. And pretty soon, Solidarity grew into a movement which I still claim was the biggest movement in history on the per capita basis, because it was about 10 million people in the country that then had a population of about 34 million. So every third and a 0.4 person was in the movement, which is absolutely remarkable. It lasted only 16 months and was crushed in December 1981. The military crackdown, many people were arrested, the union, Solidarity Union, was delegalized. Tens of thousands of people were kicked out or left Poland. The economic situation didn't improve, actually, even over time got worse. So the system sort of muddled through, eventually lifting the martial law, but never allowing Solidarity to be legal again. It was deregistered. But then there were increasing pressures in the form of strikes and demonstrations and enormous underground activity in the form of theaters, publishing, underground lectures, mobilizing, in terms of like underground unions, literally. And all of this eventually led in 1988 to a realization, all by the communists, that they had to do something. They started playing with the idea of negotiating with the representatives of the opposition of the Solidarity Union, primarily with Lech Wałęsa, the by now legendary leader of the movement. And in late 1988, the negotiations restarted. Eventually, they led to formal negotiations known as the Polish Roundtable, which took place in the early months of 1989 and was concluded by, if I recall properly, the date April 6th or something like that, early April, never remember exactly. And at that time, the communists agreed to partially free elections. And they gave, that I remember, they gave the union to prepare for those elections 63 days, clearly assuming that they had tremendous advantage in terms of resources and access to the media and so on. But it turned out that 63 days was absolutely enough. There was a tremendous mobilization by the union, which created a thing called citizens' committees, which basically emerged in almost every town, village, certainly in major cities. And then there were the elections of June 4th. The communists guaranteed to themselves 2/3 of the seats in the lower house and opened for competition 1/3 of the seats in the lower house, and also allowed fully open competition for 100 seats in the newly created Senate, the upper house. Nobody knew what was going to happen, right? Both sides were rather nervous, hard to predict. It was the first time in the history of communism that something like that was attempted. And the result was spectacular. The Solidarity won all the seats that it was allowed to contest, and it won all the seats after a runoff. But it was allowed to, it won 99 seats in the Senate. The one remaining seat went to already an independent businessman. So the communists didn't have even a single senator. And that was a surprise. It was a shocking thing to everybody. The next thing, which is of some interest, actually very critical, is that throughout the period of communism in Poland, since the late 40s, there were two satellite parties. Communists created satellite parties that really didn't have any real independence. They were just kind of an adornment, just to show that, look, we have a plural political party system, which was fake completely. They didn't have any autonomy. But in '89, after those elections, Wałęsa started negotiating with them, and they switched sides. They switched from the morally and numerically, in some sense, certainly in the Senate, defeated communists, and they switched to the Solidarity camp. And that opened the way for the creation of the first non-communist government in the Soviet bloc since the late 40s. And Tadeusz Mazowiecki, a very well-known, respected activist of Solidarity, Catholic journalist and advisor to Wałęsa, was elected the first prime minister. And in September, Poland had the first non-communist government in Eastern Europe, which then gave impetus to the kind of falling dominoes that was often presented in Czechoslovakia and East Germany, and then further south, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, which you know better, and all of this. So this is the story, which is actually quite remarkable when you think about it. It is a real revolution, a non-violent revolution with some minor, well, not minor, but rather exceptional events like the execution of the Ceausescus in Romania. But other than that, it was by and large peaceful. The Berlin Wall fell in November completely peacefully.
Right. I mean, not a shot fired. I mean, all things considered, with the exception of Romania and obviously Yugoslavia.
These a bit later, yes, of course.
I mean, these transitions. But, I mean, these transitions were almost entirely peaceful, and one would almost say orderly in that case.
Yeah, in some yes, yeah.
Very, very much orderly. So then we, and not to make too much of a leap here, but we jump ahead 30 years later, and we see that politics in Poland and Hungary and is increasingly fused with an illiberal political culture that reflects a growing sense of ethnonationalism. I would even go so far as to say historical revisionism, xenophobia, Euroscepticism. How is it that these allegedly model countries have been able to compromise this democratic social capital so much?
Well, I think that, and of course we have no time for that, but in each country it is a somewhat different story. And the results are also somewhat different. So even if we concentrate on, just for the sake of time, on the 4 countries in Central Europe, which by now it's Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, each of them travels a different trajectory. If we tend not to remember that the first appearance of the populist or populist-like politicians was in Slovakia. And it was the first time that we saw kind of early rebellion of nationalist, populist forces against what was clearly in its main ideological tenor a liberal revolution, including economic neoliberalism, but also liberal in the sense of politics, right? Which means a serious attempt to build checks and balances and the rule of law, and also introducing liberal culture, more open, less traditionalistic, ready to experiment with new lifestyles, with more acceptance of unorthodox sexual roles, a support for women and their rights. And that was the package, right? Uneven, but that was this kind of liberal package. And the first signs of rebellion early 90s were in Slovakia, whereas Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary were increasingly improving on this score of building sort of liberal political system and culture. Um, but then something snapped, right? And there are several causes. We have no time to talk about it. A huge factor is the economic crisis of 2008. So it's around that time something happens. Except that the story is, again, as I said, complicated because by then Poland is emerging as the most successful reformer in terms of economy. Initially introduced very tough economic measures. The economic situation went down pretty drastically, but in Poland it started improving very quickly. You know, by now Poland is the only country that emerged from communism that has been a few months ago declared not the developing market economy, but developed market economy. So it made it to the rather elite club of economically stable countries with sort of not only well functioning in some sense, comparatively speaking, for sure, but also well delivering capitalist economy. So Poland didn't have a decline. Every country in Europe, except for Poland and Cyprus, had a negative growth after 2008. Poland almost touched the zero, but never stopped growing. So this explanation of the economic crisis, and this is what fascinates me, and I'm running now 3 research projects on that really, is why. You know, why is it that in the country of economic success, you have a sudden turn against this kind of emerging liberal consensus? Clearly not a consensus, right? Liberal formation, but now suddenly reveals its weakness. And and by the time of when Orban in Hungary grabs power after some initial losses in 2010, Poland is already after one episode in 2006, 2007 of having a non-liberal, let's call it this way, at that time kind of mildly populist government with the same leader as now, Jarosław Kaczynski. Then they lose badly after their first attempt to kind of create this populist system, started building populist system, doing things that, in a moment, I guess we'll talk about a little bit. And then they failed and they lost power for 8 years. And then came back in 2015. By then, Orban in Hungary was in power since 2010. Hungary did suffer in 2008 rather badly. Hungary suffered also from the collapse of social democrats, former dominated, of course, by ex-communists. And Orban, who was once a young liberal, and clearly the person, if not of the left, then certain left, turned to the right sharply and found the constituents there and achieved something absolutely spectacular. Eventually, he won the constitutional majority and started changing the country in a legal way, right? Having the constitutional majority, they started changing the constitution, uh, basically creating what he himself was kind of boastfully talking about, that he is building illiberal democracy. I try to uh, discuss this with various Hungarians, including once the Hungarian ambassador to London. They were always huffing and puffing. It was very uncomfortable for them to admit in public that this is what they were doing, basically, a sort of destroying liberal democracy. But one trick that they were doing, and I think this is very useful for our students to know, is they were playing on different meanings of liberalism. Right? So politically, liberalism basically means the system of checks and balances and constitutionality. But culturally, it means the kind of a more open, tolerant attitude. And the opponent then of liberalism is not the lack of institutional checks and balances, but simply conservatism, right? So I was told not once that, why are we all sort of getting upset that Hungary is building illiberal democracy? What they mean to build is a conservative country, conservative democracy, basically, which is not true, because that, had they been doing just that, I guess most people would, the observers would not have been sort of so critical, right? This is their right to create political culture or try to build it because they won the election and they won actually a huge majority. But that was not what they were doing. Of course, they were turning toward increasing conservatism of a specific kind, specific type of traditionalism, but at the same time, they engaged in dismantling democratic institutions. And Poland started following. The thing that, the difference that I always emphasize is that in Hungary, after 2008 and this crisis, there was a tremendous anti-liberal mobilization, right, which was helped by Orban's very skillful organizing at the level of civil society. So they did now the research begins to show they did a lot of work in villages, in towns, the communities mobilizing, and they basically, Orban won on the wave of anti-liberal sort of revolt. Kaczynski didn't win on the wave of such a revolt. Kaczynski won by a hair, basically. And, technically, he won because the left in those elections of 2015 split. If it hadn't split, then he wouldn't have the majority in the parliament. He won 38% of the seats, which gave him about 54% of the seats, even a bit less. And so he didn't win on the revolutionary wave. He won a little bit by a fluke, and then he started the revolution. So it's a different dynamic, and it also is important because the resistance is stronger in Poland than in Hungary. And Poland is a country now very, very divided. I would say roughly 50-50, but I think that liberal side is like somewhat bigger, judging by various sorts of data, and even by the elections to the European Parliament a few weeks ago, which Kaczynski won, but by a far slimmer majority than it had been expected. So Poland resembles a little bit the United States in terms of polarization. Kaczynski is a bit like Trump. And the other side is a little bit like Democrats, who are still fighting to cohere into something, right? With those, recently with those two debates, we have 20 plus candidates. So you still don't know which way it will go and how effective it will be in challenging Trump in the next election. The situation in Poland is somewhat similar.
Let me ask just a few follow-up
Yeah.
questions to that. Does Kaczynski's Law and Justice Party hold a I guess a majority like Fidesz does in Hungary, or do they have to form a coalition with another?
No, they have the majority, but they do not have the constitutional majority.
Okay, so they've got a
They
so
have
it's
50, just about 50% of the seats. Yeah.
okay, so they don't have to
In both
coalition with
in
anyone.
both houses.
So they
No,
don't
they
have to.
don't. This is the first time. This is a multi-party system. This is, yes, and he can boast about it and boasts about it. This is the first time in the history of Polish post-communist democracy that one party has the majority.
Okay, but not enough to force amendments or changes to the Constitution.
No,
Okay.
therefore they use other
Okay.
methods.
And then as far as the Polish opposition, because you had likened it to the Democrats, which is now seemingly engaged in, a battle of identity between, the neoliberal remnants and the Bernie Sanders movement. Is there an emerging progressive left-wing group, movement, organization, identity in Poland today? Is there something like a Jeremy Corbyn or a Bernie Sanders, or is it still very much traditional European social democrat?
Um, there is a little bit of everything. So the main challenger, the party called the Civic Platform, that held power for 8 years before Kaczynski's Law and Justice, is center right. Although it is a catch-all party, meaning it has several wings, and it is actually a bit unwieldy conglomerate itself, but by and large, it is center right. There are various movements, which I am now trying to kind of figure out, create a better sense of what they are. On the left, they are often associated, they're basically associated, to simplify things, with two issues. One is with the defense of the constitutional order, the constitution, and the courts, because the right populists always go after the courts first. Trump would have loved to, I guess, get rid of and he talks about like that, right? The power of the independent judiciary. They managed to do that to a large degree, although they're still in the very serious struggle with the European courts, and the European courts are beginning to return last week two verdicts against Poland, against Kaczynski and his ideas, basically saying in one case that one part of the reform of the judiciary his party instituted is illegal, right? This is the situation that you have this kind of, let's call it, constitutional opposition, which has in it not only the centrist party, but some people from the left. Second organizing thing, which is proving to be more and more effective, is women and women's mobilization against the increasing challenge to their reproductive rights. So Poland has already the most restrictive reproductive rights in Europe, and now it is time to bring in religion. Poland is also perhaps the most ardently Catholic country in Europe, if not one of the most Catholic countries in terms of intensity of the impact of religion on politics in the world. And the church is increasingly conservative. I mean, it also increasingly kind of radical in its conservatism and return to a very traditionalistic values, very traditionalistic concept of family. There is a three-pronged attack on this kind of liberal culture. One is completely bizarre and strange because they fight with gender. They say they fight with gender. So you don't understand what they're saying really. But if you push it, then it becomes a little bit more clear. Then they say it's gender ideology. So what is gender ideology? Well, gender ideology is basically the idea. Of course, they distort it, but this is idea, that when the push comes to shove, that men and women are equal and should be equal pay for the same work, and the same rights in the family, and so on, and so on. That's being seen as the attack against traditional family. For example, the thing about protection of women in the family against violence. Quite a few actually right-wing politicians see the attempt to improve the women's ability to defend themselves, also in the courts, as a grave danger to the traditional family, and there is therefore the foundation of the society, right? So that gender is one thing, gay rights, LGBTQ rights is another thing, and reproductive rights, right to abortion, the third thing. All of this galvanizes increasingly the younger people, particularly young women. So there is for the first time in those elections to the European Parliament, a new party appeared called Spring, Wiosna in Polish, which is led by a rather effective politician who is gay, and he's very open about it. And they won 6% of the vote. I mean, yeah, so just enough to get whatever it is, 3 seats in the European Parliament. Whether they will perform well in the upcoming parliamentary elections remain to be seen. The old anti-peace forces created, with some exception like his party, created a coalition which is sort of center right and left. Very difficult thing to hold together ideologically. But they are all united in this attempt to defend constitutional and liberal, in the political sense, order. Whether they will win, my hunch is that they will not. That Kaczynski will win one more time, perhaps by a lower margin, because they are too divided. But there is a slim chance that he will not get the majority, and therefore will have to look for, again, go to a coalition government. And they tend to fall apart. But, we'll see.
Well, another thing that we've been talking about is certainly the issue of multiculturalism that is perceived by Central European countries to be something that the European Union is, foisting on them to accept more ideas of secular progressivism, but also importantly to contribute their fair share to housing refugees and asylum seekers from the Middle East. And the last time that I checked, Poland, or at least the Polish conservatives, are happily boasting that there are 0 refugees in Poland, that they have done their job in protecting the borders from, outsiders. Does this also play into the right-wing populist conservative narrative that Kaczynski and Law and Justice utilize as a way of defending Polish hearth and home?
Yes, all the time. And yes, they accepted a few refugees. This is not like 0. And they also claim that there's a huge Ukrainian population in Poland, because Ukrainians are fleeing not only the military conflict with Russia in the east, but also a much more difficult situation. At the beginning in 1989, 1990, Poland and Ukraine were more or less at the same level of economic development. Poland, at this point, 30 years later, is twice as rich. So it is very attractive, and many Poles work abroad in England, in Germany, France, everywhere. So there are labor shortages, which are filled by Ukrainians. So they those are labor migrants, but some politicians say that we have 1 million refugees in our country, right? So they play on words. Um, uh, but it is true that in the country that basically managed not to accept any significant quota of refugees from Africa or the Middle East, uh, the specter of civilizational catastrophe caused by incoming Islam is huge. Right? And lower educated people just don't get it. And there is this, in the Polish culture, there is this myth going back to 16th, 17th centuries that Polish armies, the Polish kings were defending Europe against the Ottoman Empire, so against Muslims, and that kind of plays well. And there is this kind of manufactured anti-Islamic hysteria with a very, very little understanding of Islam or Muslims as people. So yeah, that is definitely exploited, sometimes in an extremely ugly and vicious way. Kaczynski once in a speech talked about refugees as vermin, infestation. This kind of language, which of course then plays in another theme that is important, which is ever present, different intensities depending on period, anti-Semitism. This is how Jews were presented, as you know, in the interwar Europe. So the language is very similar in many respects, and many observers noted that. I just want to say one thing. When you said at the beginning about European secularism, the European Union doesn't interfere in this sphere. That's basically up to a country. And the key thing, though, is obviously the separation. So it's a more of the political, administrative, in a way, problem, the separation of the state and the church. That is of interest to the European Union. And in Poland, it is kind of shaky. The interpenetration of the state and the Catholic Church is too much to the taste of many people, including most of the population, paradoxically.
Yeah,
Right?
I wanted to ask. I mean, what is the public perception? I mean, Poland is one of the most ethnically and religiously homogeneous countries in Europe.
In the
So
world, I
yeah,
suppose. Yes,
I think
absolutely.
so. Yeah. So it kind of stands to it stands to understand that Catholicism has a tremendous hold on Polish identity because it was the one institution that preserved Polish identity during the partition when Poland was part of
Yes.
Germany, Russia, and Austria. But the students had read the recent article that you had co-written with Marta Kotvas, and
Yeah. Oh,
and
great. Thank you.
yeah, and it's great. It's just it's fantastic piece. Which one of the things that I particularly like about it is your mentioning of Polish political culture literally retconning history to Catholicize
Yeah.
incidents that had happened beforehand in a more secular fashion. I mean, the way that I sort of look at it is that solidarity, historically speaking, was a mass protest of dock workers who happened to be Catholic. Whereas today, the retconning is that solidarity was a mass protest of Catholics who happened to be dock workers. And I've noted
Uh,
it
yeah.
seems
Yeah.
like because you mentioned this, you mentioned that there, the many of the
Right.
monuments, the Poznan monument in particular, has been edited, augmented in a way
Yes.
to Catholicize something that had already happened. And it seems to me that Kaczynski's political narrative, whether he believes in it or not, but it's useful, is a way of somehow saying that 1989 was partly successful in dislodging the communists from government, but it didn't really achieve the full realization of Poland's Catholic traditional values, and it's his job to now finish the job. Correct?
Correct. That's, I mean, we could discuss some details of that account, but yes, as a basic outline of the main dynamic, it is correct, I would say, certainly in my view. Uh, the problem is which version of Catholicism, really, that's like with every other religion, including Islam, Buddhism, whatever you take, Protestantism, in Christianity, you have different versions, right? You can interpret a doctrine or the practice, the main ideas in many different ways. So it is not necessarily that Catholicism, which is a universal religion, should be interpreted in the narrowly nationalistic and exclusivistic way, right? Uh, so this is a choice. In my recent work, I am very much interested in this literature on elite choices. The elites in every country have serious responsibility, and if the country is relatively at least democratic, they have choices. They don't need to become, populist, narrowly defining the identity in nationalistic and religious terms, meaning very aggressive, exclusivistic type of religion. There are other versions, John Paul II was, he is clearly was a conservative, was the Pope of the Church. He was not certainly championing women's rights and women's reproductive control to the same degree that many people would like to see it these days. But nonetheless, he was for open Catholicism. He was for Catholicism of hope, of Catholicism of inclusion, Catholicism of non-violence, Catholicism of interfaith dialogue. He was the first first pope who went to a synagogue in Rome. He was the first one who started a conversation with Islamic clerics. This was the church. This was his vision. This is very much the vision, in many respects, of the current Pope Francis. Polish bishops, and I know also quite a few, if not the majority of Hungarian bishops, just reject this vision, right? This is something that, I am often scratching my head over, because if this is, the teaching of the Christ is the teaching, the way I understand it, and it's not very original, is it? That it's the teaching of openness, love, compassion, trying to be, sort of bend over and help those who fail, who need assistance. That's not the religion preached by most of Polish bishops or Hungarian bishops at the moment. This is a nasty, aggressive vision of religion's bastion, which they believe they need to build to protect the nation, its purity. I mean, those are fascist tones in it, and also to prepare for the crusade. I mean, in the piece we touch upon this a little bit. There's more on that written by others. They believe that the pure European identity, which must be based on Christianity, which for them is Catholicism, needs to be sort of has been somehow protected in Poland, survived in Poland, whereas it decayed in the West. The West is in decline. It's falling apart because its moral tissue is gone, and Poland will save Europe.
Mm-hmm. This is basically 19th century Slavophilic philosophy for the 21st. In that case, the rotten West versus the the pure, whether it's Polish or Russian or Serbian or whatever. I actually want to just bring in here for the students that are listening that this is very, very, very similar in scope to what's happening in Serbia. And Dr. Kubik,
I know.
Feel free to interject here, because you had mentioned earlier in this discussion that Polish Catholic bishops are becoming increasingly conservative, almost reactionary. And this is very, very similar to what has happened in Serbia, because throughout the 90s, The Serbian church, paradoxically, was a bastion of, I would say, a quite open theological discussion. Milosevic's nationalism notwithstanding, the Serbian church was and had a number of, I would say, very open-minded and tolerant bishops and priests. That has almost disappeared. They're still there, but they're largely silenced or moved to peripheral parishes, and much of the upper hierarchy of the Serbian church is now, good old evangelical hellfire and brimstone. So is there within Polish Catholicism this internal battle also between, reactionary conservatism and a more open traditional cosmopolitan Catholicism?
Well, let me start something to introduce a bit of a distinction, a nuance, which I'm right now working on, which is between reaction and conservatism, or in another formulation, between right-wing populism and conservatism. I am beginning to say now, right-wing populism is not conservatism. Conservatism, if you're a true, of course, there are different versions of conservatism. But by and large, conservatives believe in the rule of law. That's one of the things that they used to be attacked for by a more kind of radical left people, right? That the rule of law is not enough, or it's hiding social inequalities and stuff like that. And conservatives are saying, no, with the rule of law in itself, it's a value. Right-wing populists or radicals of this kind, they want to eliminate or at least curtail the rule of law. So the split between right-wing populists and the conservatives is of great interest to me, right? So in a way, the fate of democracy, and it's been written, for example, by Daniel Ziblatt, analyzing the difference between Germany and Britain during the interwar period, much hinges on the behavior and the alliances created by conservatives. So Ziblatt discovered a pattern in Europe, best exemplified by the contrast between Germany and Great Britain. If conservatives resisted the temptation of right-wing populists and didn't create an alliance with them, democracy survived. If they succumbed to the temptation and created an alliance, in the case of German aristocrats, Junkers, conservatives with Hitler, then it was it. The famous moments he recalls in the book where right-wing conservative politicians in the Reichstag were saying, this funny little guy with mustache, we are so powerful. What can he really do in the long run? It cannot hurt if we create a temporary alliance with him just to win more seats in the parliament and so on. And we all know how it ended. So that is the thing that not all the church, by and large, given the whole spectrum of ideas in the world, is a conservative institution. We shouldn't be expecting from a Catholic church or any other church to be, with some exceptions perhaps here and there, to be liberal in the kind of social and cultural sense. The point is whether this conservatism is practiced and preached within a democratic frame, the rule of law, and respect for the rules of the game and constitution and all of this, or it's not. So when I hear a Polish bishop saying more or less something like that it is some kind of the tragedy that the constitution is more important than the scriptures, then I know that I am on that this is beginning to be really dangerous, right? Because this is the call for a theocratic state, or at least this is clearly the challenge to the division of the state and the church. And that obviously is no longer a liberal democracy, because the church, in this case Catholic Church, so the Catholic Church is not the democratic institution. So that's the point. And the bishops are increasingly, and not only in Poland, and I know about the Serbian situation also, I mean a little bit at least, it is across the communist, the post-ex-communist countries. I mean, the same thing is, obviously happening in Russia, with the biggest consequences, perhaps, right? The alliance between Putin and the hierarchy of the Orthodox Church. The similar things are beginning to emerge, although there are splits in Ukraine, and so on. So that's the danger. The problem is not, I would say, conservatism. The problem is conservatism that is ready to sell its soul to right-wing populists.
Mm-hmm. Which sort of explains a little bit more where we are in the United States today.
Yes, very much so. Either you are, particularly in the Senate, the Republican senators have a choice. You can go with Trump, and therefore it's been my judgment, and again, it's not a very original judgment, pushing American democracy deeper and deeper into a crisis, or you can resist. And one day history will judge you, right? We should be reminding them. What did you do in 2019, 2018, and so on?
Yeah. The book that you had mentioned, that you had referenced, what's the title of the book?
The title of the book, and I never remember, but we have Google, is Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy. This is by Daniel Ziblatt, who is these days better known for his book with Levitsky called "How Democracies Die,"
Okay.
which continues. So that's the same guy. He's
Okay.
a professor at Harvard.
Okay. Yeah, that's add 2 more books to my library then. So we've got just about 10 more minutes or so. I'd like to, if possible, I'd like to shift gears just a little bit to talk about the recent election, the recent presidential election in Slovakia. Have you been following
Yes.
that? The recent elections in Slovakia and the I guess for the for the non-observant, it's sort of a surprise election of Zuzana Chaputova, who was largely elected on a platform of anti-corruption, anti-elitism, anti-bureaucracy, and a vote against Robert Fico. I wrote a piece about this a couple of weeks ago, sort of challenging the prevailing assumption that her victory is a victory against populism or a victory against Orbanism, and in many respects, it moves Slovakia, I think, more towards the left of center liberal status quo. But given the recent atrophication of democracy in the region, it's quite a welcome. It's a welcome surprise, isn't it?
It's a terrific event, but it is a bit surprising. But I wasn't terribly surprised because I been observing this kind of anti right-wing populist mobilization in Slovakia for a while. Things happened there. As you may know, a journalist was assassinated who was investigating the previous prime minister's deals with Italian mafia, Robert Fico's, and the people just had enough. There are those moments in history where something happens, and many people are in the streets, and they will say, "No, this is not the country we want to have, and just get out of here." And Fico was building this kind of mildly populist regime, kind of soft right-wing populist with a lot of left-wing elements, a bit kind of a hybrid populism, but slowly undermining institutions and certainly very corrupt, right? And here it is. This revolution started in the sense, and she came into the ring to fight. and just on the wave of this rebellion, had this enormous success. And yeah, it is a hugely important event in this part of the world, and I think in Europe. Uh, it gives you hope, gives you a sense, of course, that those things are not written in stone, that those trends go for a while one way, but then they can change. The direction may change. Um, and yeah, that's the meaning of it. And the Czechs are in the streets. They're fighting at the moment against their prime minister, Babiš, who is, how to put it mildly, a billionaire in power who pretends to divest from his investments, remove himself from running his companies, and basically putting in trust his assets and just running the country. And nothing of this is true, right? He is the head of the biggest business conglomerate in the country, and people had enough. Unfortunately, 2 days ago, the vote of no confidence, built on the basis of those protests in Prague, didn't produce a desired by many people result. It was 85 to 85 with 30 abstentions, so they needed 100 plus for the vote of no confidence to pass, right? So that didn't happen. But that's the Czech. That's another. If we had more time, we could have talked about it. The Czech populism is described by some experts as technocratic populism. It doesn't have a religious element, right? Polish neighbor, Czech Republic, Poland's neighbor, is the most secular country in the world, perhaps in Europe. So that's a very interesting contrast. So the religion doesn't play a role there. Nationalism, Czech nationalism, is very different than Polish. It is much more restrained and much sober and kind of down to earth, so to speak. And he uses this, but basically his populist sort of the elements of populism in his platform are more on the institutional, not cultural side, right? Then he is mixing, so it's corruption, is mixing personal business interest with the state business, and trying to kind of curtail the independence of the media, playing a little bit with the freedom of the speech and civil society independence. But by comparison with Hungary, it is mild. But nonetheless, it produces rebellion, right? So you have both the Slovaks and the Czechs pushing in this part of the world, and I see growing immobilization in Poland. To be quite frank with you, and I think that if it doesn't happen this time in the fall elections of 2019 in Poland, I think it will happen eventually. That the current government, the ruling party, will lose their power.
Mm-hmm. So it's much more likely that there is going to be a breaking point in Poland. Kaczynski is not going to have an Orban lock on democracy.
No. Yes. That's my prediction. I may be wrong, but right. To my mind, everything indicates that his hold on power is much weaker than Orban's. And European Union finally woke up, right? They tolerated Orban's transgressions. With Poland, they started acting way faster. The question, of course, is why? And I think the answer is it's a much bigger and more important country in Europe. It's almost 4 times as big as Hungary, and for a while played the role of this kind of emerging, interesting, serious partner in the East, right? And the European Union officials, including the Polish president of the Council, Donald Tusk, decided to play hardball against Poland, as similar way as they decided to play hardball against Britain on Brexit. So They decided they're not going to tolerate those kind of uh, dangers to the unity of the EU and dangers to its basic values and institutional sort of certainties that we thought we had in Europe, right, which are now challenged. So, that's important, right? People in the streets and Brussels beginning to show much more resolve and uh, kind of decisive ability to counteract.
And that's actually a good, on an overall sense, I think that's a good sign because it shows that at least as far as Poland, it has, I think, progressed the most in its transition. If it is now moved beyond consolidation, that Poland is able to check itself and have outside powers check it, like any other European state in that regard. So, this area here does have a high risk of, pessimism, especially when populism is mentioned. But I think it's good to end on a note of guarded optimism for Poland's immediate future.
That's I think that's exactly how I feel, kind of guarded optimism. And also, the whole story also goes against this kind of rather silly view that, this makes sense to divide Europe into East and West, and somehow things are permanently unstable in the East and permanently stable in the West. It's enough to think about what happened in Austria,
Yep.
what's happening in France, what was for a while happening in Spain, but Spain made a tremendous turn toward restoration of traditional social democracy and emerged as a major player again in European politics. And so things change, but the biggest sort of challenge to the EU came from Britain, which we used when we teach comparative
Yes, I
politics. We
know.
teach as the most stable and best calibrated political system. And what's happening here? I'm talking from London. It's nuts. It's completely nuts.
I don't know. I think that both London and Washington are in some kind of contest as to which country can
I
outshock
know.
the other, So,
Yeah,
uh, so
I know.
that basically brings us up to the hour here, and we could talk for another half hour, 45 minutes, but you guys aren't that lucky. So, I think what we'll do is, I mean, we could certainly talk more and more about this, but I think I will, defer to the comment sections if anybody has any additional questions or inquiries. But thank you once again, Dr. Kubik, for being with us for the hour and bringing us up to speed with where Central Europe is 30 years after 1989. A number of elements, particularly in Poland, are just continue to be fascinating. So I think I can speak on all of us to say that it was an absolute pleasure to have you in our virtual studios once again.
It was a lot of fun, and I am. Thank you for having me. And yes, I'm saying this to the students. I have a lot of traveling and I'm moving around a lot, but please post the comments or write to me on my email address at Rutgers, and I will do my best to respond.
Okay, so I think what I'll do then, just to accommodate your traveling, I'm going to leave the special thread, Ask the Guest Instructor, open for 2 weeks as opposed to 3. That way you will have time to adequately get back to them because I know that you're traveling back and forth here. But yes, please direct any comments or whatever to Dr. Kubik. He will be more than happy to get back to you. And next week, we are beginning our next section on Southeastern Europe. So we are trading our Trabi at the Hungarian border for a Yugo, and we'll be driving around the Balkans. Should be fun stuff there. So anyway, thank you all, and I will see you next week.